In preparation for his 1868 lecture tour, American writer Mark Twain prepared a piece titled The American Vandal Abroad, a rousing celebration of travel and a defense of American tourists. European critics of the day were often disgusted by the way the so-called American vandals approached their trips through the continent, not with conscientious respect and awe, but with a sort of slack-jawed carelessness, and sometimes even a disrespectful attitude towards the locals. While Twain was certainly willing to acknowledge that tourists are capable of misbehaving, he ultimately felt the need to stand up for American tourism, writing a riveting piece of travel journalism tracing the trips of Americans as they tour Europe that culminates in a celebration of travel itself. Twain's argument is essentially that travel alone, in the abstract, is enough to transform a person. For Twain, the solution to ignorant American tourists is not to prevent them from going abroad and embarrassing themselves and others, but to encourage them to travel more, which he believes will lead them to enlightenment. If you'll allow me to quote him at length, "If there is a moral to this lecture, it is an injunction to all vandals to travel. I am glad the American vandal goes abroad. It does him good. It makes a better man of him. It rubs out a multitude of his old unworthy biases and prejudices. It aids his religion, for it enlarges his charity and his benevolence. It broadens his views of men and things. It deepens his generosity and his compassion for the failings and shortcomings of his fellow creatures. Contact with men of various nations and many creeds teaches him that there are other people in the world besides his own little clique, and other opinions as worthy of attention and respect as his own. He finds that he and his are not the most momentous matters in the universe. Cast into trouble and misfortune in strange lands, and being mercifully cared for by those he never saw before, he begins to learn that best lesson of all. That one which culminates in the conviction that God put something good and something lovable in every man his hands create. That the world is not a cold, harsh, cruel prison house stocked with all manner of selfishness and hate and wickedness. It liberalizes the vandal to travel. You never saw a bigoted, opinionated, stubborn, narrow-minded, self-conceited, almighty, mean man in your life, but he had stuck in one place ever since he was born, and thought God made the world, and dyspepsia, and bile for his especial comfort and satisfaction. So I say, by all means, let the American vandal go on traveling, and let no man discourage him." What is particularly interesting to me in this quote is the way in which Twain argues travel not only creates a healthy interest in the world around you, but actually spurs on a political awakening. For Twain, travel is supposed to liberalize the traveler. By living with and among people of a different culture, status, or class, Twain says, you are meant not only to connect with them on a personal, but also a political level. This idea pops up in other writings by Twain as well. In fact, it could be said to be a major theme of his entire body of work. Twain was a prolific travel writer, and in memoirs like Life on the Mississippi, he describes how his own life as a steamboat pilot led him into all sorts of strange encounters that helped inform his, relative to the time, pretty progressive political views. The novel largely considered his magnum opus, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, is about a poor white child who runs away from home and is joined on his journey by a runaway slave, the travel bringing them closer together and enlightening the white child to the humanity of the black man and his cause. Travel functions in much the same way in One Piece. Most of the Straw Hats, making the obvious exception for Robin, are not politically minded, or at least they weren't at the beginnings of their journeys. As far as we know, Luffy never had any intention of becoming a revolutionary figure, of striking down tyrants around the globe and liberating whole nations. He set off for his own, seemingly selfish, reasons. He was nothing more than a Dawn Island vandal, out to see the world and have his fun. Along his trip, however, Luffy encountered unfamiliar people and cultures. He lived off of the support that others were willing to give him. Twain writes of the vandal being cast into trouble and misfortune in strange lands, and being mercifully cared for by those he never saw before. How many times has Luffy been provided with a meal, a place to stay, when he had none? Luffy did not enter Impel Down with thoughts of freeing the oppressed and wrongfully imprisoned revolutionaries inside, but after being taken care of by Ivankov and the gang, it became the obvious thing to do. When Luffy needed water in Alabasta, it was Toto that gave it to him. And when Toto was attacked by Crocodile, it gave Luffy all the more reason to chase Croco Boy out of the country. Marguerite saved his life a couple times in Amazon Lily, and the bond he formed with her was one of the key reasons he was able to befriend that island's monarch, queen, empress, goddess, and make it back to his crew alive after the time skip. I don't even know if Luffy understands who the Celestial Dragons are, but through his travels, he befriended the fishman Hachi, and when Luffy sees one of those disgusting slavers attempt to murder Hachi in a hate crime, he makes himself public enemy number 1 by sending Charlos to the Shadow Dimension. Over and over again, we see that, through travel, Luffy comes into contact with people from different cultures, societies, and worldviews, and inevitably turns those connections into some kind of political consciousness. He's almost a poster boy for the argument that Twain was making over a century ago. Regardless of its initial motivation, travel can function as an incredible lever towards political consciousness, and specifically towards a kind of progressive, left-leaning worldview. Travel breaks down bigotries, even those based on race or nation. In fact, it could be said that Oda takes this idea even further. Travel does not merely liberalize Luffy, as Twain said it would, it radicalizes him. It transforms him into a revolutionary. We shouldn't rush to align One Piece with Twain's work, however, because the series does present us with quite a few counterexamples. Certainly, Kaido traveled quite a ways to get to Wano. Would anyone make the argument that his travels made him kinder or more understanding? Rather, Kaido set up a new class system in Wano, terrorizing and exploiting the local population for decades. Blackbeard has traveled to many of the same locations that Luffy has. He certainly has not made any lasting connections with the various peoples he has encountered. Nearly all of the villains in the series are foreign invaders or oppressive colonizing forces. Twain claims of the Vandal that travel rubs out a multitude of his old unworthy biases and prejudices. What biases and prejudices are being rubbed out of the Celestial Dragons when they make their trips down to Sabaody? This exposes a certain naivete in Twain's essay, one that Oda does not apparently share. Sure, travel can be a useful tool for political enlightenment, but only if the traveler is actually open to such a thing. Twain's mistake is in assuming that American tourists are all going abroad with open hearts and minds, ready to make connections and join arms with the people they meet. It just isn't a realistic expectation. It isn't even a standard Twain himself lived up to. Despite being rather progressive on issues like labor rights and black liberation in America, Twain was absolutely appalling on indigenous rights, frequently a full-blown bigot, and this despite traveling much of the American frontier and interacting often with indigenous peoples. Travel in Europe enlightened Twain because he was open to it. All his traveling among indigenous people did not have the same effect. In fact, those trips may have made his bigotry worse. One Piece presents us with a more realistic picture. Against the almost mystical celebrations of the power of travel provided by Twain, the series presents something more level-headed and nuanced. Sure, for Luffy and the crew, people already predisposed to respect of local cultures and disdain for authority, travel can be a gateway to further political consciousness. However, for people like the Celestial Dragons, travel is merely a way for them to confirm their biases, to engage in sadistic abuses of power. And to the question of American tourists specifically, all you have to do is look up the statistics for sex tourism or see the things famous YouTubers pull whenever they visit Japan to realize that there are probably more Americans like the Celestial Dragons than there are like the Straw Hats. Travel, in the world Oda has created, and I believe in our world as well, presents the opportunity for personal and political growth. But it isn't enough on its own. Twain claims that it liberalizes the Vandal to travel. One Piece approaches the topic with a more measured cynicism, a view that was perhaps best summed up by fantasy writer Joe Abercrombie in his novel Last Argument of Kings. Travel brings wisdom only to the wise. It renders the ignorant more ignorant than ever.